Flyers coverage here on 97.3 ESPN being brought to you by PlaySugarHouse.com. Sign up now and they'll match your first deposit up to $250. Must be 21 in order to play. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Kevin Durso, our Flyers insider, joins me right now on the Boardwalk kind of hotline to talk about this Flyers team advancing to the next round of the playoffs for the first time since 2012. And in large part, it is thanks to a goaltender. Kevin, how you doing the day after?
Doing pretty well, Josh. How are you?
Doing pretty good. So, watching that Flyers game last night, aside from the fact that Carter Hart is just an impressive goalie, one could argue that last night was actually his most important win of his career because he showed you that for all the talent and ability and the focus and all the compliments that he gets, he was able to help this team win when it absolutely mattered the most.
Yeah, he did. And, I don't think that, either of the goals, this was another one of those bounce back games. He was shaky in game 5 at times, and he had a really solid game after the offside challenge that went in the Flyers' favor and kept that margin at 3-2 for a little while. But he really bounced back in a strong way. I thought that the 2 goals that he did allow weren't really completely on him. There was, when you've got a player right in front of the net who's able to get a piece of a shot and put home the rebound, that's not on him. There's a defensive breakdown that led to the second one. That's not on him either. And, for the most part, there was maybe 1 or 2 moments where he looked a little bit out of position. He got a little bit jumpy and a little scrambly in net, but otherwise he's solid like he usually is. And his ability to bounce back within a game as much as from a game that he hasn't looked his best is really the big reason that the Flyers are where they are. Is they've got a guy who doesn't let it snowball on him, and he has the composure to do that. He really showed it, and you got to give him credit because, as I wrote this morning, this is the rising star goalie who went up against his idol and in this series got the better of him.
What does it also say about the team's commitment to defense? Because it wasn't a very attractive style of hockey. It wasn't the up and down guys flying around the ice style of play. They won with their commitment to defense.
Yeah, they did, and that was pretty evident from mid to late second period. I mean, you knew what kind of style the Flyers were going to play from that point on because that was what they showed. Montreal's desperation was coming through again. They were looking for that tying goal. They felt like they had some momentum after they got that quick goal to make it a 1-goal game again. And this was another third period where the Flyers went out and basically knew the style they had to play to win this game, and they went into lockdown mode. They just they tried to shut down the opportunities. Montreal still got 13 shots in the period, and that was more than they had in the first or the second. But a lot of those chances were later in the game as the desperation gets higher. You're playing for your life here. And for most of the period, they did what they had to do. They blocked the shots. They get in the passing lanes. Space is relatively limited. I still think it was more open than we'd seen in the first 4 games of the series. Game 5 was really wide open, and Game 6 had some more openness too. There were breakaways, and there were odd-man rushes. But for the most part, the Flyers kept the possession to the outside. They had a few really good forechecking shifts late in the game that helped to waste some time off the clock as well. And I think that the really impressive thing about the commitment to defense was that they were without one of the guys who was known for his defense throughout the year. Matt Niskanen was out on that 1-game suspension. Phil Myers jumps up and plays significant minutes. Travis Sanheim played significant minutes. Shane Gostisbehere had an outstanding game, which says a lot considering what everybody thinks about him from a defensive standpoint. He had a really outstanding game and stepped up in a big way when it mattered most, and that's what the Flyers needed. They needed the guys to step up and fill the roles the right way, and all of them defensively did. I actually had asked Chuck Fletcher earlier today about the Sanheim-Myers pairing because that was a pairing that still stayed together until probably about the third period, and part of his answer was to win that game without Matt Niskanen. That's a huge confidence boost, and it's not just to guys like Sanheim and Myers, but to all of them. So collectively, the defensive effort that they showed in this series and to win that game without a big defensive presence is huge for them, and that's momentum that they need to try to take into the next series.
What does it also say about the team that despite the chippiness at the end of the last game, that overall they were the more disciplined team? They didn't have the most penalty minutes. Yeah, they didn't score on the power play goals, but they weren't the one going to the penalty box as often. They weren't the one making some of the more risky plays like the Canadiens were.
Yeah, their discipline was very huge in this series. I wonder what it would have looked like if the Canadiens had more power play time than they already did. The power play for Montreal really shifted a couple of those games. They did get a power play goal in Game 5. They had 2 in Game 2, and that was collectively those made huge differences in those games. And when you can spend less time trying to kill penalties and play in that pressure situation where you're just trying to hold on for dear life, like they did for much of, the Flyers held on for a series, but had to play that defensive style in order to win. There's no taking that away. And Montreal gave them pretty much everything that they could throw at them. And when you don't give them the opportunities to have that extra man for that long, and even down to, I think there was a couple of games in this where it took Montreal a long time to get Carey Price out of the net to even get the empty net situation where you're at 6-on-5, and that gives you an man advantage as well. So the lack of playing without that man down situation for the Flyers turns out to be huge because it just separates. It gives them more time to waste time, even when the power play wasn't completely clicking like it was in Game 5. You waste a lot of valuable time that Montreal has to try to get back in these games. And I think that what it says a lot about is that you play that disciplined style while you're in the driver's seat. The Flyers led for a lot of this series in terms of getting an early goal and trying to carry it for most of the way. And they did that a lot by not taking penalties. You really don't you don't open the door a whole lot for Montreal to try to get back into it. They're going to have to earn it at 5-on-5 the way they had for most of the series. It was a close series, but that might have been one of the big separators, is that the Flyers were the more disciplined team, and it allowed them to have more time to try to pursue offense and maybe run time down, as opposed to give Montreal the opportunities to find that tying goal when they needed it most.
Kevin Durso joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you are following on Twitter at Kevin_Durso for all your Flyers and NHL covers. Flyers Game 1 this Monday, 7 p.m. versus the Islanders here right here on 97.3 ESPN. Kevin, before we get to the Islanders matchup, I'm curious because one of the things that been brought up in the postgame, whether it was the Flyers radio network, whether it was the NHL network late last night, everywhere I've heard people bring it up is, well, this Flyers team got outscored by the Canadiens in this series. And my devil's advocate response to that is, how much of the Flyers' scoring problems was it their offense versus the fact that they played a goaltender who the entire year faced the most shots in the NHL during the year? He was playing at a high level already, and that you're not going to see a goaltender of the caliber of Carey Price in every round.
Yeah, there's part of it that fuels that argument. And I think, when you're playing Carey Price, I think you do get into your head a little bit. You feel like everything has to be perfect. You're trying to pick corners more. You may miss the net on those chances. That being said, I think what ended up happening ultimately is that the Flyers ended up having to play the series that was given to them. And I say that meaning Montreal just took away a lot of space. And the Flyers, I think, struggled from an offensive standpoint to adjust to that necessarily. They had to try to shift line combinations and try to find the best combinations that were going to allow for maybe a grinding shift that gets you a chance at the front of the net, going hard to the net, whatever you had to do to try to get anything, shot volume, traffic at the net, opportunities, whatever you had to do. And Montreal took away a lot of that space. You can't play a series from here on out. I don't care who the goalie is. You can't play a series from here on out and expect to take 17 shots, 20 shots a game and think you're going to come out of it winning. You need to create more shots. And if you're going to create more shots and more traffic at the net and get more shot volume on the goalie, you're going to have to find other ways to do it. You can't necessarily rely on that. You can't rely on the cross-ice passes all the time, trying to find the perfect setup. And I think they did that a lot in this series and I think some of that is fueled by who the goalie is. So maybe now you make an adjustment to that. I think Chuck Fletcher was right when he said that the team not only has another level to reach, but they might have to reach it in order to keep going here, because you managed to get away with it against Montreal, because I don't think Montreal could match the depth of the Flyers ultimately down the road as the series progressed. But teams like the Islanders and teams beyond that will be able to match that depth and be able to come at you in waves the same way and take better advantage of it. I think you started to see guys emerge for Montreal that were going to be those types of guys, but it was probably too little too late. And ultimately, when a series deficit, yes, Montreal outscored the Flyers in the series, but it was 13-11. It's not, it wasn't some ridiculous number or crazy margin here. It was close the whole way, and the Flyers need to be better in terms of just attacking the offensive side of the game and trying to get more shot volume, because if you don't get more shot volume and take more chances and really get that going, and especially get some of your high scorers going, you're going to be in trouble down the road as you try to keep this run going. So they need to get that part going, and I don't think it really matters who the goalie is. You've got to just find a way to really attack the defensive side of these other games with the offensive players who proved that they could do it and score and have high-scoring games throughout the season.
Let's talk about the Islanders. An Islanders team that in their first two rounds, their series versus the Panthers, then their series versus the Capitals, they outscored their opponents 30-15 in those two rounds. My first question for you, Kevin, is, in your eyes, watching the Islanders play those two rounds, how much of the Islanders' high-scoring output was partially a byproduct of the teams they were playing? Because, at least in my eyes, I felt like the Panthers were obviously the lesser team compared to the Islanders, whereas the Capitals, it just seemed like that they were maybe they're a year past where they were and then where they could be as a championship contender.
Well, I think that qualifier series, Florida was really no match for the Islanders, and I think the only question you had was neither team really, the Islanders don't jump off the page at you. They don't have a lot of guys who you would qualify as superstar type players, but they do have a lot of quality, and they have a lot of depth, and they have guys who know how to fill the roles that an offense has. And they're not, in a lot of ways, they're not too different from the Flyers in the sense that they take advantage of opportunities going the other way. If you thought that the Montreal series was tight checking, maybe boring at times because you're going to play that defensive style, just wait until you see a series against the Islanders, because that's what they do. That's the Barry Trotz method. That's what you're going to get with this team, and it's going to be tight space, and it's going to be, you're really going to have to execute. And maybe that's the alarming thing about the Flyers offense, is that the execution always looked a little off in a lot of areas, and I think that now you need to really refine that. You need to be really on your game, because the Islanders play this style where, I don't know that, Washington didn't look good to me at all in the round robin in a lot of ways. And I think part of that was missing guys like John Carlson for a time and things like that. And, realistically not even being able to go to another goaltender either. Braden Holtby had to shoulder this whole run that they were going to go on because of the fact that they couldn't have Ilya Samsonov in the bubble at all with an injury. So that changed the aspect of it for Washington too. But nonetheless, I think that Washington was an inferior defensive team to the Islanders. Now that the Flyers are going to go up against them, you're going to have to see that same defensive style, but you need to see the Flyers really amp up the offense too, because the Islanders have shown that they can score. And if you think that it's just going to be strictly a defensive series, because that's what the Barry Trotz method is, you're wrong. This team really pounces on you. They can come in waves, and if they come in waves the same way that Montreal looked like they were in a couple of those games, then they will finish their opportunities, because they're just relentless. Anders Lee is a really talented captain, and what more can you say about a guy like Matthew Barzal, who is just he's ridiculous with his skill, and he's the all-star type that I think Montreal's on their way to having a couple of them, because I think you started to see shades of it. Nick Suzuki's going to be a really good player in the league, and Jesperi Kotkaniemi is going to be a really good player in the league, but Matthew Barzal's already there to that level. He's an all-star, and he's got the ability to just completely dismantle a defense with his abilities. And that's the type of guy you got to watch out for. And then just the grinders that they have beyond that. J.G. Pageau was a great trade line acquisition for them. You think about guys like that. You think Anthony Beauvillier, who's a guy who is a gritty little player who really knows how to score goals. And they've got all that. Brock Nelson's another one who's got all-star capabilities, who's really good too. So they've got a wave of players who are really talented and know how to finish just as much as they defend. So that's the challenge for the Flyers, that this team is going to bring it to you from both ends of the ice.
If the Islanders do have a weakness, or there is something that's a flaw in their armor, and it's something you can take advantage of them, what is it?
I mean, there's really not much that you can look at on the surface that's a flaw. I mean, about the only thing I can think of off the top of my head is that this is not the same goalie matchup that was in the last series. This isn't someone who is going to be as highly acclaimed as Carey Price is, and that's not to say that Semyon Varlamov hasn't played well in the playoffs. He has. It's just not somebody who carries around the same reputation as Carey Price. So maybe that doesn't get into your head as much. This is Carey Price at the other end of the ice. This is the guy who steals a lot of games. I don't think that anybody looks at the Islanders and thinks that the goaltending is the sole reason they win games. I think they just look at the overall defensive structure. And maybe that's what surprised the Flyers about the Canadiens, is that I think you sat there and you looked at that series and thought, yeah, the Flyers might lose a game, and they might lose two in the series, and it's going to be because of Carey Price. And realistically, the two games they lost weren't because of Carey Price. It was because of Montreal's ability to take advantage of the opportunities and actually finish on them, as opposed to just getting pressure in waves. I think that surprised the Flyers a little bit, and now they're going to go against a team that shouldn't surprise them in any areas. It's a team that's going to come in waves offensively. It's a team that defends well, and it's a team that gets good goaltending when they need it. It's just not necessarily as high profile of a matchup. There's really not a guy, like I said, I think Barzal's the closest thing that they have to a true superstar in the league, but they don't have that guy who really takes the headlines all the time before the series even begins. That's what Carey Price was for Montreal. That's what Alex Ovechkin would be for Washington. That's what Sidney Crosby would be for Pittsburgh. And, guys like that. The Islanders don't really have that guy who is necessarily a face of the league yet, who takes all the headlines. And that's, I think, the thing that might play into the Flyers' favor, is that there's not one guy you really focus on. Barzal's had some really good success against the Flyers, but I don't think he's the lone guy you focus on. I think that there's a collective team here that you have to focus on, and there's not one guy who's going to beat you. It's going to be a team that's going to really go at it hard against you, and that's what you have to focus on if you're the Flyers, is that this is a really well-rounded team that's going to give you a run for your money for sure, especially if you play the way you did against Montreal. So this is where you need to really refine your game and play as sharp as you can, because that's going to be the ticket to getting to the conference finals, is playing a really sharp game and sticking to the defensive structure that you had in round one as well, but getting much more from the offensive side.
Kevin, one more before I let you go. I want to ask you a question that I feel like we've had this conversation about this specific part of the Flyers a multitude of times over the last several months, and that is, what do we do with the defenseman? Because Niskanen got suspended, so we assume he'll be back and he'll be good to go, but it feels like they keep shuffling these defensive lines. I thought Gostisbehere played well last night. I think Haig has proved himself to be, him and Phil Myers have proved themselves to be completely necessary and important. They have to be on the ice in the lineup every single night. So what do you think Alain Vigneault is going to do with the defensemen versus the Islanders?
Yeah, that's going to get really interesting, because I'll start with this. There's a clear-cut top three, and everybody knows it, I think, by now. Ivan Provorov, Travis Sanheim, and Phil Myers are always part of the picture here, as long as they're healthy and as long as they're able to play. So they'll be heavily involved again in this series, I would imagine, no question about it. From there is where it gets a little bit foggy, because of the fact that Matt Niskanen really factors into that as well. I think he's part of that top four that doesn't really change too often. And there was elements of that game 6 where they did miss him. So he's part of this. And then you have 2 slots left for 3 defensemen who have all been doing certain things well, but, and really you could interchange any of them. Robert Haig's been a good physical presence. He hasn't really been a complete liability from any real end of the ice. I don't think he's been terrible in any game that he's played. He had, I think he had one really, obviously that third pairing had a really poor shift in game 5 where Montreal scored the eventual game-winning goal right after the Flyers had tied the game. But other than that, I don't think he's been as much of a problem. The thing that's going to be hard is Shane Gostisbehere really just had probably the best game I've seen him play in a long time at both ends of the ice. That's the thing. He didn't get any points offensively, but he's around the situation. He's involved in that play that sets up the second goal that Kevin Hayes scores to make it 2-0. He nearly scored a power play goal walking out in front of the net by himself with no one really around. And, credit to Carey Price for being such a good positional goalie that he takes away that angle, and there's no room for Gostisbehere to do anything with it other than to just try to take the shot and see if it leaks through. And that's rather unlikely against Carey Price. But he played a really strong game, and I thought that the thing that really stood out was that it wasn't the offensive side that made it such a strong game. I thought he had a strong defensive game. And it's going to be hard to take him out of the lineup now, I think. And that really leaves you with Justin Braun, who I think has left a lot to be desired as a veteran player on this defensive core. And I think they're in for an interesting decision, because I think they're going to want that veteran presence in a series like this, because I think that could go a long way. But I also think that they're going to need to put the best 6 out there at all times to try to find a way to win this series. So they have an interesting decision ahead of them with those 3. And, so I think the top 4 doesn't really change, but those 3, There's a lot of interchanging that can go on, and I think you might see them try something in the first game again, kind of like what they did after the round robin. The first game of the Montreal series, I thought that probably absolutely should have been Shane Gostisbehere's game over Robert Haig because he had played so well in that final round robin game. And I looked at that first game, and even though the Flyers won it, I kind of thought Gostisbehere's type of play didn't fit the series at that point, and Haig's did, so I would have put Haig in there, and they got blown out in game 2 as a result, and then the change came. And ultimately, the only way Gostisbehere found his way back into the lineup in the series was by virtue of the suspension to Niskanen. So I think that you're going to play around with those three guys and try to find the right combination again that fits the style that the Islanders are going to play. And I think on the surface, you go with Haig and Braun probably because that's what's going to fit the style. But Gostisbehere really showed me something in that last game, and I think he showed the coaching staff something as well. And that might give him a shot in game 1 to see if he fits that style and can play that game consistently. And that would help him stay in the lineup throughout the series.
He's Kevin Durso. Follow him on Twitter at Kevin_Durso for all your Flyers and NHL coverage. Flyers versus Islanders game 1 this Monday night at 7 p.m. right here on 97.3 ESPN. And check out all of Kevin Durso's coverage of the Flyers over at 97.3 ESPN.com. Kevin, great stuff. I'm sure we'll be talking more as the series continues, and hopefully the Flyers continue to make a deep run.
Yeah, absolutely. Always great being on, Josh. Thanks for having me.